Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 2024 McCain Conference. I want to extend an especially warm welcome to those who are coming from great distances. I know we've got a lot of cadets and midshipmen from other service academies, colleges around the country. We've got faculty and staff from other schools, war colleges, and so on around the country, and frankly from around the world. So a special welcome to you. And it's really for your benefit. It's perhaps appropriate that I set a little bit of context and give you a little bit of background for those who are visiting the Academy for the first time as to what the Stockdale Center actually is. It's oftentimes referred to as the think tank for the Naval Academy on matters of leadership, ethics, and character, but also more broadly for the larger Navy, for the Marine Corps, other government agencies, and such. But at the end of the day, in the variety of things that are done at the Stockdale Center regarding leadership and ethics, the crown jewel in so many ways remains the ethics research program. The center was stood up initially in 1998 as the Center for the Study of Professional Military Ethics. And from that point forward, the idea, the charter, was to serve as a driving force on the topic of military ethics that would not only shape the curriculum and the conversations had on moral development here at the Naval Academy, but would influence the broader conversation. And it's because of the efforts of folks like our Director of Ethics Research, Ed Barrett, who many of you, most of you perhaps know quite well. He's been at the center for some 18 years now. And together with Dr. David Luban, our Distinguished Chair of Ethics, they do a tremendous job of scanning the horizon in regard to military ethics on an annual basis in order to select those topics that are most pertinent to the needs of sailors, Marines, airmen, soldiers, guardsmen, and the like. And this year is absolutely no exception. They typically float the idea for what is to be discussed and considered, doing the deep dive research for the following year. And when they brought up the issue of this particular annual research and this year's conference, Liberal Democracy, Challenges and Critics, I could not have imagined a more timely and important topic. And if you've had a chance to look at the program to this point, you'll see fascinating topics, timely topics, and some very, very controversial topics. But unlike much of the conversation that has been taking place nationally and internationally, we'll probably avoid some of the shrill voices that you hear in this space on national media outlets and things like that for a more reasoned, rational conversation that approaches these challenges and critics from every angle. That can't always be said either, right? There's usually these simplistic, single-dimension solutions to those challenges. You won't experience that here within the next 48 hours. I can guarantee that. The nature of the speakers that have been chosen by both Ed and David represent every possible take, every possible angle on the challenges to democracies here at the United States and beyond. So it's kind of with that, I should also double down on thanking Ed. Ed does a tremendous amount of lifting throughout the year. This conference really is just the culmination of a year-long research project. It doesn't end after the center concludes this conference. In fact, the publishing of the findings of what you'll hear today are done. We encourage all of you to stay in close touch with StockdaleCenter.com. You'll find not only the minutes for this particular conference, you'll see links to our YouTube channel, and all the other offerings that this, again, internal think tank of the Naval Academy serves up. And they range from podcasts to short feature films, for example, current ones on artificial intelligence, to feature-length movies that have been nationally televised on public television regarding the POWs, the repatriation of the POWs, and the commemoration of that event. So again, by all means, please do go out to that site, take a look at the literally thousands of things that are put out there, and we look forward to your feedback. And in fact, we look forward to your feedback on what transpires here in this conference today and tomorrow. You'll have an opportunity to send some things back. Aside from Ed and David, the folks that are going to be reviewing some of that feedback are also really critical to the execution of this conference. Our events director is Karin Ornberg, who's standing in the back of the room right now. I have to give you just a quick idea of what our events director does here at the Stockdale Center, because in a period of just over a week, we hosted General Stanley McChrystal for the Honor, Courage, Commitment Luncheon, followed almost immediately by an evening lecture from author Ryan Holiday. This event this week, and almost immediately after the conclusion of this event, we will host the National Military Ethics Case Competition. So midshipmen and cadets coming from around the nation hosting service academies and military colleges here in Luce Hall and pulling it off. And only Karin could juggle that many events in a 1 week period. It's staggering, and she does it year round. And she does so with the able assistance, too, of our financial management analyst, which is Miss Sarah White, who you would have met at the reception desk today. So that team of logistics support makes all of this possible, but certainly Ed and David, their ideas, their thoughts, their guiding the weekly conversation that leads up to this are extremely important. So with that, I would like to invite Vice Admiral Yvette Davids to the podium. But first I want to just say a couple of words about Admiral Davids. She's been here as a 65th Superintendent only about 3 months now, ma'am, is that correct? So in a very, very short period of time, I've got to say, those of us that have been on the yard for a long time have been amazed by her level of energy, her level of focus, her passion, not only for the Naval Academy, but how the things done here at the Naval Academy with these emerging officers, these future officers for the Navy and the Marine Corps, how it all fits into the bigger picture. Because the arc of her career is interesting and it's inspiring. She is a military child, born into the family of an Army doctor who worked with Special Forces, and took the unexpected path to the Naval Academy in spite of that upbringing, I suppose. And when she came here, was a competitive sailor on the dinghy team. That's where she met her husband, now Rear Admiral Keith Davids, who serves as WARCOM out at Coronado. Also a very talented and competitive sailor in his own right. And it's important, especially for the cadets and midshipmen, to hear this, I think. And she oftentimes says this, that she came into a Navy very, very different from the Navy that we have today. Combat exclusions prevented the service of women in certain warfare specialties. And in her case, she went to a surface vessel as a surface warfare officer. That was part of that combat exclusion. But through some exposure during the first Gulf War, saw what life on a warship was like. And then that arc of her career and her life took her to eventually command USS Kurtz and USS Bunker Hill. And she was later recognized by a very prestigious national award as the first Hispanic woman to ever command a warship in the United States Navy. And if, again, you look at the tours that she's had both in the fleet and the operating forces, such as commanding the Nimitz Strike Group, but her shore commands have been equally impressive, to include in the State Department, and here as the Director of Naval Academy Sailing. So it's for those reasons, and 100 more that I could talk about, that we are so very honored and excited to have Vice Admiral Yvette Davids open up officially this year's McCain Conference. Ma'am.
Dr. Thomas, that was exceptionally impressive of you to have memorized all of that. I have to think through my own history, but I really do appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad you're here in this beautiful, beautiful auditorium, and thank you so much, sir, to USNI for lending this space, which is incredible. And Dr. Thomas, as the director of this think tank of ours, it's just phenomenal what you do and the sort of the course you have shifted the Naval Academy on to ensure that we're all of us are supportive and ready to support our midshipman development into the leaders of character they will be. So thank you and your entire staff for all this. So I'll just say a few comments, but I'm so pleased to see so many folks here. It's from so far away. It's really, really inspiring. So good morning, distinguished guests and visitors and members of our Naval Academy team, and thank you to Dr. Thomas Thomas again, and thank you to everyone from the Stockdale Center who has worked tirelessly to put together the phenomenal conference that we're going to have this year. And a special thank you to Dr. Edward Barrett, Ms. Karen Ornberg, and Ms. Sarah White. I really appreciate all that you have done in the background to make sure that this year's is exceptionally successful, as it will be. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to the 23rd Annual McCain Conference. The Naval Academy is truly at its best when we bring together our dedicated faculty, our staff and student body with academics and partners from around the nation to engage in conversations on the most pressing and the multifaceted issues facing today's society. And that's what we're going to do this week. And here at the Naval Academy, the study of ethics is central to our mission of developing officers of character for our Navy and our Marine Corps. The Vice Admiral James B. Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership, since its inception, has been leading the formation with respect to our initiatives to further the study of ethics and help forge a deeper understanding of ethical leadership within everyone who works, lives, and studies on the grounds of the Naval Academy. The McCain Conference is special because it brings together those in the profession of arms as well as those who instruct, that teach, develop, work alongside those in the profession of arms to discuss and debate matters of critical ethical importance. And perhaps no issue has any greater tie to the history of our nation and our profession of arms than the concept of liberal democracy. And I would wager that our guests from Australian Army and the Royal Navy, that it's also as well the impact there on the Australian and British profession of arms as well is just as significant. As officers in the United States military, we swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And to our midshipmen and to the cadets present, when you finally cross that stage at your respective commissioning ceremonies and you raise your right hand again and retake your oath of office, be reminded that you're swearing your allegiance not to a person, not even to America as a nation, but to the set of ideals that establish the foundation of who we are as a nation, we the people. The McCain Conference, once again, serves as a unique venue to bring together the diverse and multidisciplinary perspectives needed to have fruitful and informed debates and discussions of this topic. And I'm sure you'll walk away from this conference having truly examined the complexities surrounding the fundamental idea of liberal democracy. And I want to leave you with a quote from James Stockdale, the namesake of our ethical center, who wrote in his memoir titled Thoughts of a Philosophical Fighter Pilot the following: "Those who study the rise and fall of civilizations learn that no shortcoming has been as surely fatal to republics as a dearth of public virtue, the unwillingness of those who govern to place the value of their society above personal interests." This is what you get to think about this week. I can't thank you enough for joining us here at beautiful Naval Academy, particularly to our midshipmen and cadet guests. This is very much a part of your history, as it is a much part of ours. Thank you for making us better. Thank you for assisting all of us to think outside the boundaries. I am absolutely certain that there is something you're going to learn this week that you're going to take away with you and inspire others with. So with that, again, Dr. Thomas, thank you so much for giving this opportunity to so many, and I look forward to being a part of this. Particularly, I will be here for the first speech. In general, I cannot wait to hear what you have to say. So with that, thank you again, Dr. Thomas. Thank you and welcome, everybody.
So what I thought I would do now is read you General Allen's bio. Actually, I won't do that. Because if you haven't read General Allen's bio and you haven't researched General Allen and you haven't Googled everything you can about General Allen, I would suggest that when this is over and after you hear his remarks, that you go back and do that, because there's an amazing context to what General Allen has been able to achieve over his short life. And I can say that now because he's only 2 years older than I am, and I'm not willing to get old yet. General Allen was 2 years senior to me here at the Naval Academy. And for those of you who are from other service academies, I would challenge you to think of that person 2 years ahead of you that has inspired you at this point, because I can tell you this: General Allen was an inspiration. And I was in the class of 78 and he was in the class of 76, and I don't know how it goes now, but as a plebe, the second class were not exactly people I fell in love with. And yet, his leadership was an inspiration. And then, as my career advanced and his career advanced, what isn't necessarily always in his bio is that he received the most prestigious award that the Marine Corps can hand out, in my opinion, and that is the Leftwich Trophy for company grade leadership. It was my privilege to compete for that award that year, and I would tell you this, as much as I wanted to hate him that year, I couldn't, because he's that kind of a leader. He had shown that kind of leadership. He's the kind of leader that you want to be on this stage this morning to share his experiences with you. He's one of the few people that I can say could be here and talk about each and every one of these topics that will be covered throughout the course of this two-day conference, because he's lived it. Not because he's studied it, not because he's invested himself, and to be honest, he's done all of those things. He does not commit himself to do anything that he has not researched and studied and made himself, maybe not an expert, certainly he would say he's not, but I would offer well-read but also well-educated on the topic. And I'm just going to give you a couple of snippets, but really it's one snippet. What's not always reflected in his bio is that in 2007, General Allen went to Iraq as the Deputy Commanding General, which most people would disregard, but he was the Deputy Commanding General for Governance and Economics. And it was General Allen's exclusive efforts that brought the tribes of Anbar province onto the side of the United States, which ultimately translated itself to the rest of Iraq, and what created from what was a very difficult situation a success. But in that, he took this idea of liberal democracy in a country that really had no understanding of it, but yet had a constitution that was driving it in that direction, and was able, through the culture of the society, to build an economic structure, to discuss each of the topics here. And yet he knew that his work was not completed, and so he handed it off to another group of Marines. And then as I was showing up, he invested his own personal leadership in me to help me follow in his footsteps. And what we saw in Iraq, contrary to a lot of published documentation, if you will, was that in 2009 and 10, 2 years after his beginning of this hard effort, there had been over $28 billion of foreign direct investment in Anbar province itself. The relationship with those sheikhs, the cultural identities, the challenges that had been put in place had all been overcome by someone who had invested himself in each and every one of these topics. And not only in those topics, but in the people that would come along behind to sustain this. General Allen represents everything that our founding fathers intended this country to have in order to sustain liberal democracy. And that is to build and to sustain an informed electorate that will allow us to continue this amazing thing we call democracy. So, sir, it is a pleasure to introduce you. It is, more importantly, a great pleasure to call you a friend and a mentor. And with that, I would offer General Allen.
Well, sir, with that introduction, right? That's what a phenomenal introduction, and a very, very accurate introduction, because I can't think myself of a finer example of a warrior philosopher to kick off as challenging a topic as we've taken on for this year's conversation. So welcome back to the Naval Academy.
Great to be back.
I have to also say that this is a little bit of a full circle moment for me, because one of the first people to welcome me to the Naval Academy as a battalion officer was then Commandant Colonel John Allen. So this feels like a full circle moment. I get to welcome you back now after you initially welcomed me.
And you overcame it.
To your staff, right?
Overcame your early contact with
To
me.
your staff, yes. Yeah, you were an inspiring leader as a commandant and went on to do even greater things. So it's such a great honor to have you back here.
My honor, truly.
Obviously, you've seen the challenges that we are going to dive into. And as mentioned, as General Wissler very eloquently discussed, you've had both the study of these factors as well as a great deal of experience in these matters. So perhaps we should just open it up with your overall view of today's state of liberal democracy in this country and beyond.
Well, it's terrific to be back with you here. Admiral Davids, thank you for your remarks. For those of you who get the chance, and if she's willing to surrender them, those remarks were fantastic. And there were pieces of wisdom that shot through those remarks that should be emblazoned in everyone's soul here with respect to democracy, the state of democracy, and where we want to go with democracy. It's really important. It's great to be back. I did 3 tours here. One as an inmate, one as an instructor in the political science department, and then I came back to, was briefly deputy commandant and then commandant during the period of time we were attacked on 9/11 and then after we invaded Iraq. So it was a pretty momentous moment in this institution. I'm so glad that this conference is organized the way it is. These are all critical issues that need to be addressed. The room is full of many different kinds of people. I'm going to be speaking in large measure to the cadets and midshipmen here this morning and the military in uniform. But of course, my heart and my comments go out to all the people in this room, because for me, while I swore for 45 years, the period I was in uniform, to support and defend the Constitution, as Vice Admiral Davids talked about, and was willing to die for this experiment in liberal democracy, I still am. I believe it's the most powerful, the most relevant form of government in the world today, and I'll come back to that in a moment. I knew John McCain. Didn't know him well, but I knew him. He could pick me out in the crowd because I had the opportunity to testify in front of him several times. And the experience of knowing him as sort of a friend and then testifying in front of him were different experiences, actually. But he held us to account. He was brilliant. He was grounded in the ethics of our naval service, but more importantly, the ethics of our government. And he was, to me, one of the great representatives of the whole idea of American liberal democracy. You know, we hear terms like there is a decline in liberal democracy, or there's an erosion in liberal democracy. I don't like those terms, frankly, because I think the principles of liberal democracy, the attractiveness of liberal democracy, the value of that term persists. The issue isn't whether liberal democracy is in decline. The issue is whether those who are committed, those who live within it, and those who are committed to it continue to uphold their responsibilities to it. Liberal democracy is a very difficult system of government and governance to lead. Now, we're very fortunate in this country, and we are fortunate today to have people from other countries here, allies, precious allies. But we're very fortunate in this country to have a constitution. I'm going to come back to that and hit it hard in a few minutes. But that Constitution is the basis and the platform for our liberal democracy and all that it should stand for, which at the very heart of who we are as a people, liberal democracy is about the human rights of our citizenry. And it's about the willingness of our citizens to come together and to offer through a process of suffrage, voting, to offer to a central government the capacity to lead a country. In other words, our government exists by virtue of the will of the electorate. So people talk about the erosion of democracy, and it isn't about the concept that is eroding or the decline. It is that those who have an inherent responsibility to the principles and to the virtues of liberal democracy, they have either intentionally through commission or unintentionally through omission failed in their duties ultimately to support those principles. And in particular, we've seen in recent years, and I'm not going to get political here, but it's going to be difficult to talk about this without some of the difficult moments that we've had. We have seen an intention to attack the trust that the citizens should have in the institutions of government. That trust is inherent to how we vote and for whom we vote. We have seen intentionally efforts by state legislatures to circumscribe the capacity of all citizens who deserve to vote to have access to voting. Because in a liberal democracy, of course, the consent of the governed, the citizens have to be able to vote. Yet we have seen one legislature after another attempt to circumscribe that capacity for elements of the societies, and often, frankly, they are the populations of color or populations of disadvantaged, to give them access to voting as other members and other citizens of our country have. So erosion of trust, limitation of suffrage, and then often we have seen an overextension of the executive, assuming unto itself authority and privileges and capacities that our founders and our framers never intended. So I don't worry that the idea of liberal democracy is in decline, or that the idea of liberal democracy is in erosion to the point where the idea of it does not have relevance any longer. I worry about the leadership of this country and our capacity to produce leaders in this country who understand their inherent responsibilities to the Constitution and to the electorate of this country in order to make the liberal democracy of the United States the example for the world. Now, you asked about global democracy, I think. And we have seen a real erosion there. When I was younger, that was a long time ago, by the way, I believed, as my father raised me to believe, that the arc of history would eventually deliver us in the post-World War II era and during the Cold War. The arc of history would deliver us ultimately to a trend towards democracy, liberal democracy, and we would be dealing with authoritarian or totalitarian states like the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, and others, many of whom have since collapsed and have been absorbed into the alliance of NATO. I believed that. I think most of us believed that the arc of history was moving irrevocably towards democracy. But we have seen that there's been an erosion of that. That arc is not clear any longer. It's not clear for several reasons. Part of it is something I've already explained, and that is while democracy is relatively well understood in the context of protection of human rights, the consent of the governed, the idea of a free and open and objective press holding leaders accountable, universal suffrage, all those things are relatively well known and are relatively well documented in the various countries around the world. But what we have seen is a rise of illiberals, if you will, who have used democratic principles and systems of democratic government and democratic processes ultimately to achieve some level of political consolidation in their countries, then systematically began to unravel the democracies from within. We've seen this in Hungary. We've seen this in Turkey. To some extent, we saw this in Poland, although I think that that's being reversed to some extent. We're seeing it again in Slovakia. And these are NATO partners. So the rise of the rise of illiberals who would take unto themselves authoritarian-like privilege is, in fact, an corrosive element operating against liberal democracy as we know it. If you've not read, and here's another force at work, so we have the erosion because of human interaction with the principle of liberal democracy, but the other force that is at work And if you've not read it, you should read the 4 February 2022 joint statement between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping in Beijing as Putin arrived to congratulate Xi on the Olympics. Read the joint statement. God help you if you do. But it is, in essence, a manifesto of Russia and China joining in their capabilities ultimately to eclipse the US-led liberal world order, which has brought prosperity and peace to this world in ways we've never seen before in the history of humankind. But the Chinese and the Russian intent to come together with whatever their erstwhile allies look like, to erode the American influence and ultimately the liberal world order, is very clearly spelled out in that manifesto. So we have an erosion from within, if you will, of those who are not willing to live up to the principles of liberal democracy, and we have an erosion from without of the authoritarians, the illiberals, and the totalitarians who see us as the greatest possible threat to their capacity both to attain and retain power at the expense of their people and their electorate. So I don't go to bed at night despairing that the idea of liberal democracy is headed towards the ash heap of history. But I do despair at night that in 2024, we as a country have not firmly grasped the reality that it's only going to be through leadership, decisive leadership, principled leadership, that we can restore the trust of our electorate and our citizenry in the institutions of government and the governance of liberal democracy, and ultimately to move past the partisanship, the populism that has in many respects been forces at work to diminish the attractiveness and the value of liberal democracy in our society.
Sir, I know you're a big fan of examining first principles. We've had those conversations in the past.
Right.
And you've given us an excellent overview of the challenge being faced right now. But from the perspective of first principles, what's really at stake in this conversation? Values at stake, such as justice, values in play, rule of law, that are so foundational to this conversation. Can you give us some insights as to the nature of that conversation and how that first principles conversation is playing out in this country and again beyond, if you can?
The first principles, I think that, again, for all of you in uniform in this room and those of you who study this as a regular basis, for me, the first principles was always the American Constitution. It was the basis of the rule of law. It is the basis of our commitment to human rights. And while there was a time in our history where the Constitution didn't apply to all Americans, just didn't. If you were a person of color, it didn't apply to you. If you were a woman, it didn't apply to you. If you were an immigrant from certain parts of the country and could not afford to own land, it didn't apply to you. It applied to a certain group. That Constitution today, though, does apply to all of us in this room. And it is inherent in our responsibility in uniform, and for those of us who are scholars, to, I think, make the case that the first principles are really enshrined, contained in, and enshrined in our Constitution. Three quick sea stories, very quick. And we're being videoed, so I got to be careful what I say. Because they're not about liberty, I promise you. I was about to lead my battalion landing team in the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit into the Adriatic with the certainty we were going to be committed ashore, would be committed ashore in Bosnia during the war. And you get pre-deployment leave, so I brought my family up here. We're all sort of from the Northern Virginia area. And we went to the archives, and I wanted to put my eyes on the Constitution. I had never seen the Constitution in its original form. And I remember standing there, looking down at the Constitution, reading it, thinking to myself, to this moment, I have sworn over and over again that I would be willing to give my life to defend the principles enshrined in this document. And my daughters came up to me and they said, Dad, is there something wrong? And I said, no, I'm overwhelmed by the moment. I mean, I'm looking at the document that has shaped this country's first principles and in many respects has shaped the principles for governance in many other countries in the world. And I've sworn to give my life to protect this. I've never laid my eyes on it before, and I'm about to deploy into almost certain combat. And this is really meaningful to me. So for me, the Constitution is not a theoretical commitment to the Constitution, not a theoretical concept. And for everyone in here in uniform, the Admiral who has led major combat forces at the very edge of American influence on behalf of the liberal world order and our allies, that's not theoretical for her in her leadership or any of us who've been to Iraq or Afghanistan or Bosnia or Philippines. It's not theoretical. And two quick stories. As a young officer, I was really grateful to be plucked out of a program, a school program, with several others, to be made special assistant, and I won't give you names or dates, et cetera, to a very senior Marine Corps leader. And it was many years ago. And we had seen a shift in the administration, and there were clear policy issues coming down the pike for the military to embrace. And frankly, the potential for the embrace of these was very mixed in the services. And I had this experience which shaped my commitment to the Constitution in so many ways, where a meeting of the most senior leaders of my service was to discuss these potential policy initiatives. And the senior leader in the room stood up at one point in the conversation, raised his hand, and said the following: I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same. That I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office upon which I'm about to enter, so help me God. He stood there for a second, he lowered his hand, and he said, I can find no place in my oath of office where I will not execute faithfully the policies that we must soon embrace. I mean, this was a moment for me. This very senior leader actually went back to first principles. The right to wear a uniform, the right to give someone an order to go forward under fire and perhaps give their lives or to take life. That same Constitution, that same oath of office was being recited there to see at the most senior levels of the service whether there was room in that oath to do something other than to follow the orders of the commander-in-chief and the president. That was really a moment for me. And I understood the power of first principles and the power of the Constitution. And another quick story. 1st of June, 2020, for those of you who remember it, it was a pretty grim day where the peaceful demonstrators in Lafayette Park were cleared with great force and brutality. And the President of the United States walked across the street and held up a Bible in front of the church and was joined in a photograph. That was a bad day for our country. It was a bad day for American democracy. And it was a bad day for the appearance of whether we had flown from our obligations to the Constitution. And shortly after that, I got a call from one of the senior people in that picture. And the question was, what now? How do I recover from this? And my response was, fall back on our first principles. Fall back on the Constitution. You can never appear in public again without anchoring yourself firmly to your loyalty to the Constitution and disabusing anyone that your loyalty eclipses the Constitution and is to a person, as the Admiral said this morning. That oath isn't to a person. It's not to a cloth. It's not to a building. It's not to a symbol. It is to a set of principles. That's what makes us who we are. And when I served as the commander of a 50-nation coalition leading the war in Afghanistan, I always invited as many of the officers from the coalition to come when I swore in my officers for promotion. Because I wanted our allies to see that we are not just with them in war, but that there is something unique about being an officer of the service of the United States. Because every time someone is promoted or augmented into the service, every time, that oath is re-administered. Not to remind them of their obligation, but once again to have them commit to give their lives for a set of principles. And that is what underwrites and undergirds this idea of liberal democracy. So I don't worry that liberal democracy as a concept is winking out. I worry that there are people who do not have the courage, first of all, the intellectual capacity to understand the principles of the Constitution, and then the courage to live those principles. Our founders and framers did not intend that this sort of government would be led by those who would not embrace, espouse, and live these principles. Every now and again, we got some folks that didn't, and we took care of them through the system of justice delivered to us through the Constitution. But for you, young cadets and midshipmen, when you take a moment to think through the words of that oath, an oath that has bestowed upon you the awesome responsibility of life and death decisions in the face of the enemy to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, think through those words. They are not a meaningless stream of rhetoric. You are committing your life to something. And very few people in our country do that. Very few people are saddled with that responsibility. Some would say a burden. I don't think it's a burden. Very few are saddled with that responsibility, and you must understand the exceptional moment of that oath, the exceptional privilege you've been given to deserve a commission in the forces of our military, and the privilege that you have been given in leading the women and the men of our military. And it all comes back, Dr. Thomas, to your point about first principles.
Awesome. Sir, as you well know, we spend a lot of time in the formal curriculum and conversations beyond the curriculum trying to anchor the lessons of the Naval Academy in the Constitution and in that oath. And in full disclosure for those here at the conference, General Allen is still very much involved, in fact, resurrected a course that I believe you initiated in the early 2000s called Human Factors in Combat.
That's right.
And has come back around to us today. And that course is being taught this semester with General Allen's participation and so on. And a big part of the lesson there also is anchored in the idea of the Constitution. Beyond those first principles, beyond that precious Constitution on which we all align duty and service, this topic of threats to liberal democracy in this country and beyond have ramifications that go well beyond those basic principles. Give a great explanation to the cadets and midshipmen of the things that they should keep in mind in regard to their service, the things that guide their service. What are some of the other things they should learn about, one of those things that they should fully understand, or better understand at least, before graduation and commissioning, about these threats, because it's going to shape the environment that they step into?
Well, I think first of all, you have to live your principles. You can't just know about them, you have to live the principles. I just 2 days ago spent the day on the battlefield at Antietam, and I've been teaching that battle for many, many years. The number of young officers on both sides, but the number of young officers, and my own family, I had 22 members of my family serve in the Union Army. With one exception, every one of them was either killed or wounded or suffered from a camp disease that left them incapacitated. The young officers who led the attacks at Antietam and who were wounded and killed in huge numbers, that once again for me reinforced the fact that leadership from the front in all things, not just being technically qualified in your field, not just in being administratively proficient, but leading morally from the front. Because in the end, your sailors and Marines, your soldiers, while they may not say it to you, they all hope against hope that you possess the moral authority to give that awesome order to move forward under fire in whatever form your warfare specialty takes. We're all under fire in some form or another. To move forward under fire and either take life or sacrifice your own for higher principles. So understanding the full dimension of leading from the front in all things, I think, is inherent in who you are here. That comes from the study of philosophy, comes from the study of leaders like Admiral Stockdale. It comes from sitting in classes where we have instructors and professors who have been studying the human philosophy and the philosophy of war their entire lives, and can impart those morsels of wisdom that can strengthen your soul and strengthen your spirit. And I not only call on you to be a leader from the front, but I also call on you to be what I call a spiritual leader. This has nothing to do with religion. Again, I'll just go back to the Battle of Antietam, which, if you never studied it, it was the bloodiest day in American military history to this moment. Thousands and thousands killed and wounded. And often, as we have seen in American military history, and we have precious friends here from Australia and other countries, the UK, when our forces were exhausted, when our forces were beleaguered, when our forces were often outnumbered, against all logic, our troops would get up off the ground and go forward because they were spiritually led by someone to whom they were personally committed. The greatest leadership comes from spiritual leaders. Now, that could be based upon, in my mind, could be based upon your religious faith, but it doesn't have to be. In the end, religious faith conveys a set of values. Spiritual leadership is about the leaders living spiritual values. I can track those back to the Constitution, by the way. But living spiritual values that will motivate your young sailors and Marines in that moment of crisis, that moment of truth, when everything about the environment seems to militate against success, yet you will still be able to prevail because of the power of your spiritual leadership. Study the biographies of the great leaders. As I used to say to my students, whether it was at the infantry officer course or the basic school, I commanded both, or here as a commandant, find one campaign and study it relentlessly. Read the biographies of the great leaders who themselves went through a hot fire. And what you'll find if you study the lives of the great leaders in the biographies, almost all of them had a mentor. Almost all of them, in their moment of truth or their period of crucial leadership, could track back their success both to their personal professional development, but also because a mentor had inspired them. Inspired, by the way, is to fill with the Spirit. Inspired them to higher principles. So study the biographies of the great leaders, those who have been through the hot fire, those who have led successfully, but sometimes you have to study those that failed. What caused them to fail in the face of the enemy, or what caused them to fail in the face of adversity? And then resilience. Study about resilience. All of us, all of you, are going to get slapped down at some point. And your capacity to get picked up, to be picked up by your mentor or your commander, or to get up on your feet yourself, dust yourself off and get back in the fight, whatever that fight looks like, wherever it might be, whoever the enemy might be, but be resilient enough to get back up on your feet and lead from the front. Resilience has been a hallmark of American leadership in combat over the years. So study about those personal characteristics, study about the bios of the great leaders. And I put that course in action here right after we were struck in 2001, because there was no place else in the yard where we sought to give the future ensigns and second lieutenants an exposure to what's going on in the souls of those you lead in combat. I mean, we were headed for the biggest war since World War II on two fronts. Yet we at the Academy didn't inherently imbue in the soon-to-be graduates a sense of what's going on in the minds and in the spirit and in the souls of our troops. And I wanted us desperately to be exposed to that. You know, everything from the first principles we talked about all the way to how a leader leads a unit that is taking casualties. How do you confront the death of those who serve under you? How do you carry a unit through grief? All of those realities in combat. Now, we're now removed, again, from that environment. But I couldn't have been happier than to be confronted with a phone call last year that we are now reinvigorating that course. Because that exposure can't occur in your first firefight. It can't occur in your first moment of crisis. You need to have lived through as much as you can of it while you're still here at the Academy.
And on that point, some will find it interesting that that course, as I mentioned, is taught this very semester. And later on this afternoon, in that course, General Petraeus will be dialing in to speak via Zoom to the group.
We've had Petraeus, McChrystal.
That's right.
Bill McCraven, Jim Mattis, and then I was the lightweight that came in behind. So.
Yeah, quite a collection of warrior philosophers, no question. I'd like to shift gears a little bit on this conversation now. So the bulk of this certainly and appropriately aimed at the cadets and midshipmen that are out here. But part of the 2 days that we'll spend here is to ponder possible solutions to these challenges. Not only to delineate those challenges, to discuss those challenges themselves, but to offer solutions for these things. And I think that's every bit as important, perhaps more important for the cadets and midshipmen to understand it, but all those here gathered as educators. Given your background, not merely in uniform, although that is substantial, but your roles leading organizations like Brookings, or your current role at Microsoft.
Yeah.
You're engaged in conversations that are forward-looking, that are determining the way that we're going to take on these challenges as a society. Can you offer us some thoughts, some ideas to inspire this next 2 days for solutions? Because it's not all pessimism, as you've said.
Yeah, I'm actually optimistic. You know, this country has had the capacity to present the leadership we have needed in moments of crisis that might not have seemed possible. So I'm actually not despairing of the American experiment or the state of American democracy. You can find all kinds of reasons to not like this or not like that or not like this person or not like that idea, but I'm not despairing of the future of the American democracy because this country continues to produce the kinds of leadership we need to carry us through the crises. I was really impressed, and again, I don't want to get into the politics or individual politicians, but I was really impressed yesterday listening to Speaker Johnson after he was confronted in an interview where the interviewer really just gave him a machine gun blast of one problem after another. How are you going to handle it? And he finally got to the end and he said, one of the most important things about where we need to go as a country is to create the capacity for us to be able to talk to each other again. For a number of years now, if we have opposing views on matters, that almost immediately creates a sense of enmity. if we have opposing views on matters, it takes us into an argumentative environment where the noise of the argument drowns out the potential wisdom of the conversation. And I really appreciated his comment. And if you listen to him, if you listen to those who want us to go in this direction, one of the most important things that we can do to remedy the hyper-partisanship or the hyper-polarization that we frequently encounter is commit ourselves to civility. And civility in another way, another word, is to be willing in the conversations to respect each other, regardless of our origin or our gender or our race. And that's been on the wane. There have been some very serious issues in my mind on that matter. And segments of our population have seen this moment as a means to create, in moments of crisis for democracies, often those who would seek to be authoritarian or would want to be authoritarian, they have to create the image of an, quote, an other, someone to whom you can blame or someone about whom you can blame the problems of society. And I think as we move forward in this process, being willing to have the hard conversations, being willing to be able to accommodate other people's views without the opening conversation creating a sense of enmity and contrariness, I think is a very important first start. I had a scholar that worked for me at the Brookings Institution who witnessed with sort of horror the 2016 presidential campaign. And we all know how that ended up. Afterwards, that individual came to me and said, but she was horrified that great, make sure I've got the word right, great violence had been done to the idea of American political civility. And she said, it wasn't just our civility, but she said so much of the rest of the world in their democracies, in their political debates, rely on the civility of the American political conversation, ultimately to moderate their own political differences. And then I would say, organizations like this, which is far better equipped today to prepare the midshipmen, and I'm sure at West Point and the Air Force Academy and other schools that might be here, are far better equipped to concentrate commitment to ethical behavior, leadership principles, character development, the concentration of the names you read out earlier today, the idea of the Stockdale Center, the leadership of this superintendent. We're far better equipped now to go after those components of personal development as an officer that equips you, the young woman or man, to lead from the front in all things moving forward. But I also think we could do a lot more on the issue of teaching Americans, in any case, how our government works. I think we do an awful job in civil society in that regard. And we've all sort of wrung our hands and lamented the erosion of civics as an important part of the civilian education in this country. The level, I think, and this is not a criticism of the American people, but the level of unawareness or even, slightly harshly, ignorance about how our government is organized and how the principles of how our government are organized facilitates the lubrication of legislation and ultimately the execution of laws and the enforcement of laws within our society that protect the weak and protect the minorities and provide for the consent of the governed. I think we don't know enough about that in this country. And the more Americans are informed about the realities of the mechanisms of government, the more we're able to understand that inherent to that is our capacity to have a conversation as a people, so that when we do cast our votes in a democratic process, we truly are submitting ourselves to an informed governance by the people.
Sure. Sir, I'm very grateful that you agreed to fireside chat format for this, to be able to interrogate some of these ideas to kick this two-day conference off. But it would be selfish of me and probably irresponsible of me if I were to be the only one to get to ask you a few questions. So with your permission, I'd like to offer out in the little bit of time that we have remaining, if there's questions from cadets, midshipmen, the educators we have here, on anything that you heard in this conversation that you'd like to kind of pull that string on. And I see someone up there, please.
Sir, thank you for your time. We generally regard liberalism and fascism as opposing viewpoints. How would you view or characterize the relationship between liberalism and Califism? Are they able to coexist or
Liberalism and what?
Califism, as in the caliphate? Yeah. That ideological approach.
Do you want me to talk about the caliphate as a representation of radical Islam?
Yes, sir. Having spent time in Iraq.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in this. First, let me say that I have enormous respect for the faith of Islam. And almost every time I was ever killed in combat, it was trying to help a Muslim. And I've recently had the honor of celebrating Iftar in the holy month of Ramadan with Muslims. I felt very comfortable at home. I gave a speech a few years ago where I said I believed that I was a better Christian because I had watched pious Muslims practice their faith. I got a report out of the dark web that I was going to be taken prisoner by Christians and re-indoctrinated. The caliphate, and if you're talking about the caliphate, I'm assuming you're talking about the Islamic State. The caliphate was different than Al-Qaeda, because they are different. Al-Qaeda was a reaction to Western penetration of Islam, and was really a defensive philosophy to oppose the imposition of infidels, if you will, what they called crusaders and the Jews, us, the imposition and the penetration into the holy spaces of Islam. It's a defensive ideology. The caliphate, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi formed the caliphate from Al-Qaeda in Iraq. I mean, we got most of those guys, but we didn't get the ones we really needed to get, and he was one of them. They left Iraq, went to Syria, gained capacity in the Syrian civil war of late, and then were ejected out of the Al-Qaeda fighting force because of their extreme views. So if Al-Qaeda is largely a defensive ideology, the caliphate was in fact an offensive ideology with the intent that the offensive capabilities of the caliphate under Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi intended to do several things. Acquire as much terrain as possible within which the caliphate would now have a physical manifestation, to acquire control over as much of a population as they could, which is in many respects Mosul, but northeast Syria, northwest Iraq, to erase the Western imposed boundaries of the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the infidels' penetration into the region, and to create this, I didn't pay him, by the way, to ask this question, and to create something called the Dar al-Islam, the House of Peace, the House of Islam, within which the faith of Islam by the original of the emirs would be practiced. Because the rest of the world is called the Dar al-Harb, or the place of, house of chaos. So the caliphate is offensive. Daesh was offensive. It went too early. I was in the world. I was President Obama's special envoy to lead the coalition against it. And all of Al-Qaeda and Hamas and Hezbollah and all these other groups, they all thought the caliphate went too fast, too early. They didn't have the backing, and they're going to get whacked. And they did. And all those other groups entrenched themselves in their belief that their philosophies, in fact, were going to persist. Now we've seen Hamas. We're watching Hezbollah shelling the northern part of Iraq. Liberalism, Western liberalism, in many respects, couldn't be more different than the philosophy and the ideology of the caliphate, just at a human rights level. Just at a human rights level, and respect for the rights of women and minorities, et cetera. So they're just profoundly different in so many ways. I hope that gets to some part of your answer.
Sir.
General, thank you for your service.
Thank you.
I would respectfully suggest we have two major problems that I'd like you to answer. First, we've strayed from first principles in many different ways. And secondly, we now have a republic which is supposed to be a representative democracy. It's not representative of nor responsive to the general public. One party's been taken over by a wing to the left, another party's been taken over by a wing to the right. A vast majority of Americans are in the sensible center. They're largely unrepresented, compounded by close margins in the Senate and the House.
Well, I don't disagree with what you're saying. We've been through difficult times before. The period of time of McCarthyism was as bad as this country probably has seen shy of this moment. And again, I just walked off the battlefield at Antietam. It couldn't have gotten worse for our country. So you're exactly correct. We have a party that seems to have lost its way. But when you dig down into that party without having to dig too deep, what you find is they really still are committed to the Constitution, but they are being led in the wrong direction in many respects. But inherently, the institutions of our government have remained intact. Whether people don't believe in them right now is different than the fact those institutions have collapsed, or that inherently the agencies and the departments within the executive, or the elements of the process for legislation, or the capacity of our judiciary to still interpret the law, all that still exists. We may not like what we see today, but it's been bad before. We've had times where we were actually pretty pleased with how things are going, very critical of it, frankly, on almost all occasions. But again, I could not agree with you more. There are difficulties now that sometimes seem impervious to our leadership. But while I share your views that I'm really frustrated, sometimes really angry about what I see, having sworn to give my life for all of this for a long period of time, my view of history tells me that as long as the institutions remain intact, we'll find our way back to leadership. Let's imagine the election going in one way at the end of this year, or going another way. In one way, we could have a greater difficulty than you're even experiencing right now. We are. But I just have to say it. If Donald Trump doesn't get elected, it really liberates, in my mind, it really liberates a large segment of that party now to follow what they know to be the truth. So I like you, am frustrated with where we find ourselves right now. But the institutions, the Constitution remains intact. The institutions remain intact. We don't like how they're being executed, and I think that will change over time because I do have confidence that the right leadership will come forward. So thank you for that question. It's a really important one.
Come here, and then.
Sir, we've never met, but we were in Baghdad together, and despite how things turned out, things were going really well when we were there.
Yeah, I don't know what happened after we left, right?
You know, I do want to offer one footnote to your comment about Lafayette Park, and then I'll ask my question. But just a reminder, there were 49 U.S. Park Police that were injured that night, and there was a fire started in the nursery in the basement of St. John's Church. So it wasn't a peaceful protest.
Well, people reacted to the way the police operated. I'm with you.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
Well, they broke through the physical barrier, and literally the only thing that was keeping them out of the White House was the line of park police and
Yeah.
Secret Service, and I think anyhow. midshipmen and cadets here fall under the Hatch Act, and they will when they're commissioned.
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask you, though, about retirees. You and I are both. There have been some pretty high-profile political statements. Do you think the Hatch Act no longer applies when people take off the uniform? And I realize if a retiree goes into politics or they work for a think tank,
Yeah.
It's part of your job description.
Sure.
But where are we both, the perception of the active duty and the retirees, particularly flag officers, your peers and friends, the imperative to remain apolitical?
Well, to the first part of your question, there is no place for a serving member of the United States military to take a role in politics. Your capacity to do that in one form or another is expressed through your responsibility as a citizen to vote. And that's it. You can't campaign for someone. You can't write op-eds. You can't go to fundraisers in uniform. You cannot, as a serving member, specifically participate in the political process. Once you take your uniform off, though, you're a citizen. Now, you may be referring to me. I gave a speech in 2016 where I publicly supported Hillary Clinton and publicly decried the potential for her opponent's election. Now, I got a lot of questions about that. For me, it wasn't really about the political position. Now, I knew Senator Clinton, Secretary Clinton very well because I sat in the sit room of the White House with Bob Gates on one side of the table and her on the other and President Obama at the end, and it frankly almost never got better, or hasn't been better in a long time. It was a magical combination of leadership and commitment to our country. But the reason I came off the bench as a retiree to speak publicly was because the candidate for office was calling for the carpet bombing of civilian populations to get at terrorists, calling for special operators to assassinate the families of terrorists in order to register American opprobrium and anger, calling on American uniformed military to participate in the torture of detainees in order to get information. Calling on them to do that. That was an explicit bit of the rhetoric. And I came off the bench because, first, our uniformed military couldn't say a word about that. And many of the civilians had no capacity to comment on that. And it required, in my mind, folks like me and others to express the fact that our military doesn't stand for the carpet bombing of civilian populations. Our military isn't going to kill families of terrorists because they're terrorists. And by God, we're not going to participate in torture. We just aren't. And so for a political candidate running for the presidency of the United States and to become the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military and armed forces, to intend for the military to do those things under his leadership, and the rank politicization of the institution of the military, it had to be decried. And many other officers spoke up about it as well. So you raise a really important point. This is a delicate thing. Why should generals and admirals ever take a political position publicly after they've retired? It's all a very individual decision. For me, I didn't stop being loyal to my oath of office and to the Constitution solely because I took the uniform off. But I saw the potential commander-in-chief of the United States being prepared to commit our military into the violation of law of armed conflict and crimes against humanity. And I had to speak out about it. It's a difficult decision, and we are ambivalent about it in the American public. Lots of Americans say, admirals and generals, you got no room. You have no role in this process whatsoever. You should shut up and go home. But part of what caused me to serve 45 years in the service also caused me to come off the bench, because I love this country so much, our democracy so much, our Constitution so much, that when someone wants to have our young sailors and Marines participate in the slaughter of innocent civilians, I won't stand for it. So that was my thinking. You ask a really important question, and it goes to the heart of who we are as a people. Thank you for that.
In the honor of the final question, to a midshipman.
Sir, to third class Fraser, you mentioned in our development that we need to look to history. What were some of the campaigns or figures that you personally studied, sir?
Many. You know, as I worked my way up, I tried to study leaders who were a couple of ranks above me. One of the great books, I think, I don't know what you're going to do as far as warfare specialties, warfare selection, but for ground forces, if you're thinking about that, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, Hal Moore, Army general. Not just an Army general, but the great thing about that book is it talked about the Army family and his precious wife, who, when Hal Moore's battalion was surrounded, cut off, with the NVA attempting to kill every man in that battalion, he was fighting them day in and day out in a spectacular battle in the Yadrang Valley in '65. As the death notices came home, his wonderful wife, his precious wife, took them all from the taxi drivers who were delivering them to the front doors. And she personally handed out the death notices to the members of that battalion. We Were Soldiers Once and Young. It takes you through the decision-making requirements of a battalion commander in combat right down to the machine gunner and the private infantryman, and then takes you to the home front where you see an Army family at its best, a military family at its best. One of the great biographies I ever read was the biography at a more senior level. I read it at every level from major on, and I read it just before I went to Afghanistan to take command of the war, was the book Defeat into Victory by Viscount Sir William Slim, Bill Slim, who was, it may be one of the best biographies of World War II because he takes you through what it's like at a human level to command a theater of war, which is where I ended up ultimately. And I think I had read about this general or that admiral having moved through the moments in history of that crisis or that moment of truth. I never really studied the physiological effect. And he takes you through that as well. He's a very unassuming, humble man. And Defeat into Victory is one of the great biographies of a commander and the decision-making that's difficult. And then, as I said, I picked a campaign early, Antietam. Importantly, when you pick a campaign and you study the history, having the history be in the same language on both sides, I don't know whether you're a linguist or not, but in this case for the American Civil War, courage is courage, leadership from the front is leadership from the front. The enormity of the issues associated with supplying armies in the field are logistics issues we still deal with. They're mechanized and they come from many different domains, but the decision-making responsibilities and challenges for the leaders generally are about the same because in the character of war and the nature of war being the human factors, that really doesn't change. And I read virtually every book that's been written on the Battle of Antietam. So I can go to any one spot on that battlefield and absorb the human cost of the bloodiest day in the American Civil War. And why did I study that? Because eventually, as a diplomat, the outcome of Antietam, which was a bloody, horrible day of slaughter on both sides, that battle did two things that potentially preserved our country. That battle, 17th of September, 1862, it convinced Lincoln that it was time now to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which changed the Civil War, the most horrible experience of the American people. More casualties there than anything else. From it being an argument over a constitutional law to the freedom of a people. But it also convinced the British and the French, who were poised to intervene in the war on behalf of the Confederacy, that that cause was lost. So that campaign for me took me from close combat at the point of the bayonet all the way to the most senior levels of considerations of grand strategy. You cannot go wrong by picking a campaign and studying it relentlessly. Study the biographies of those who've been there before you. You don't want to learn these things firsthand, I'm telling you. It's the last thing you want to do.
So what a completely appropriate point at which to end this conversation, because I've heard you often refer to the quote, sometimes attributed, I think, to Basil Liddell Hart, that there's no excuse to have anything less than a 3,000-year-old mind,
Yeah.
right? Because we can avail ourselves of these studies going back
Exactly
centuries, in
correct.
fact, millennia.
Exactly correct.
And I think most would agree with me, everybody would agree with me, it's very rare that we actually encounter someone with a 3,000-year-old mind. And with that, we'd like to thank you for your time, General Allen, for coming back, and your words of insight and wisdom.
Thank you very much. Best of luck to you all.
Outstanding. Well done. Well done. And please take 15 minutes, recharge your coffee, and we'll see you back in here. Thanks. General, that was